What if the worst 5 minutes of someone's life turned out to be the exact 5 minutes that saved it? On a damp October evening in Portland, Oregon, a man named Nathan Cole was standing near the hostess stand of a small Italian restaurant called Calabria, waiting for a table that had been delayed twice already, when he noticed something that made him forget about being hungry entirely. At a corner booth near the window sat a woman alone, her hands wrapped tightly around a glass of water she hadn't touched, her eyes fixed on the door like she was either hoping someone would walk through it or praying no one else would see her sitting there by herself. Her name, though Nathan didn't know it yet, was Claire Bennett, and 3 minutes earlier her blind date had stood up mid-sentence, mumbled something about a work emergency that didn't quite add up, and walked out without looking back. The strange part was that everyone in the restaurant had noticed, and almost everyone had pretended not to. A waiter refilled water glasses 2 tables over without making eye contact with her. A couple near the bar exchanged a glance and went back to their menus. Claire sat there in a dress she had chosen carefully that morning, replaying every word she'd said in the last 20 minutes, searching for the one mistake that had made a grown man walk out of a restaurant rather than finish dinner with her. She had already decided what she would do. She would wait exactly 4 more minutes, just long enough to not look like she was running, and then she would leave through the side door so fewer people would watch her go. Nathan didn't know any of this. What he knew was that something about the stillness of her shoulders looked like a person trying very hard not to fall apart in public, and it reminded him uncomfortably of himself 2 years earlier, sitting in a hospital cafeteria the night after his sister's accident, surrounded by people who kept their eyes down because looking at him would have made it real. He told himself it wasn't his business. He told himself this twice, actually, and was already halfway back to the hostess stand when something pulled him around. He walked over to her table, and before he could second-guess himself any further, he asked the only question he had, "Can I sit here?" Claire looked up at him with an expression that shifted in less than 2 seconds. First confusion, then suspicion, then something close to exhaustion, as if she was bracing for one more stranger to make this night worse. "Why?" she asked, not unkindly, just tired. "Because the guy who left clearly didn't know what he was giving up," Nathan said, "and because I'm starving and they sat me next to a table of 4 screaming toddlers." It wasn't smooth, it wasn't even particularly clever, but it was honest enough that Claire actually laughed, a short surprise sound she immediately seemed embarrassed by, and she gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Fine," she said, "but if you're secretly weird, I'm leaving, and don't even think about ordering for me." He sat down and introduced himself, and for the first 10 minutes the conversation stayed safely shallow. The weather, the menu, how Italian restaurants always make you order more bread than you need. But there is a particular kind of honesty that comes out in people once they've already survived public humiliation once that night, and somewhere around her second glass of wine, Claire mentioned, almost as a throwaway line, that this was her third blind date in 2 months and the third time she'd left feeling smaller than when she walked in. Nathan didn't offer sympathy, which surprised her. Instead, he asked what she actually liked doing when she wasn't being set up by well-meaning friends, and that single question opened something. She talked about the small architecture firm where she worked as a structural drafter, about her secret obsession with collecting vintage maps of cities she'd never visited, about a half-finished plan to drive the entire Pacific coast alone someday, just to prove to herself she could. He told her about growing up the youngest of 4 brothers in a house where nobody ever finished a sentence without being interrupted, about the year he spent fixing motorcycles in his uncle's garage instead of going to college, about how he ended up, almost by accident, managing logistics for a shipping company downtown. Neither of them mentioned how strange it was that 2 strangers were still sitting at a table an hour after one of them had been abandoned at it. The restaurant thinned out around them, chairs being stacked at the far end, a waiter quietly mopping near the kitchen door, and still neither of them reached for their coat. At one point, Claire's phone lit up on the table, a text from the friend who had set up the date, asking how it went, and Claire turned the screen face down without answering it, which felt, to both of them, like a small private decision neither wanted to examine too closely yet. When the check finally came, Nathan reached for it before she could, and Claire raised an eyebrow. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said. "I want to." There was a pause before he asked if she'd like to do this again sometime, not as a rescue mission this time, just as 2 people who happened to like talking to each other. She studied him for a moment, the kind of look that weighs whether trusting someone again is worth the risk of being wrong about them, and then she slid her phone across the table so he could put his number in himself. 3 weeks later, they went on their first real date, and Claire later admitted she had been more nervous walking into that one than she had been waiting for the blind date that fell apart. Their relationship grew the unglamorous way real ones often do, through canceled plans rescheduled without resentment, through an argument over something forgettable that ended with both of them laughing at how seriously they'd taken it. Through the night, Claire finally told him the full story of why her last relationship had ended, a man who made her feel grateful just to be tolerated, and Nathan listening without trying to fix it, just staying present while she said the hardest parts out loud. There was a harder stretch around the 8-month mark, when Nathan's job required a transfer offer to Seattle, and for 2 weeks neither of them said much about it, both quietly assuming the other would eventually pull away first. It was Claire who finally brought it up over dinner, asking flatly whether he was planning to take it without telling her, and Nathan admitted he'd been terrified that mentioning it would end things before they'd really started. They didn't solve it that night, but they talked, really talked, for the first time about what they actually wanted, and 2 days later, Nathan turned the offer down, not out of pressure, but because he realized he didn't want a version of his future that didn't include the woman across the table. There was another moment, smaller but somehow harder, that neither of them talked about for a long time afterward. Around the 5th month, Claire ran into Marcus, the man who had walked out on her that first night, at a coffee shop 2 blocks from her office. He looked at her like nothing had happened, smiled the same easy smile, and said something about how he'd always meant to apologize, but things had gotten complicated with his ex that week, as if 4 words and a vague excuse erased what it felt like to sit alone in front of a room full of strangers. Claire didn't say anything clever in the moment. She just nodded, said it was fine, and walked out with her coffee shaking slightly in her hand. She told Nathan about it that night, expecting him to be angry on her behalf, maybe say something about going to find the guy, but instead Nathan just listened, and when she finished he asked a simple question. "Do you still think about that night as something bad that happened to you?" Claire thought about it longer than she expected to. "I used to," she admitted. "Now I mostly think about the breadbasket and how you stole half of it before I even decided if I liked you." It became one of those small inside jokes that outlast the moment that created them. A way of turning what could have stayed a wound into something they could laugh about instead, and somehow that single conversation did more to close the door on that humiliating night than any apology from Marcus ever could have. There was a harder stretch around the 8-month mark, when Nathan's job required a transfer offer to Seattle, and for 2 weeks neither of them said much about it, both quietly assuming the other would eventually pull away first. Claire spent those 2 weeks rehearsing speeches in her head about being independent and not needing anyone to stay for her. The same speeches she'd given herself after every relationship that had quietly fizzled out before. It was Claire who finally brought it up over dinner, asking flatly whether he was planning to take it without telling her, and Nathan admitted he'd been terrified that mentioning it would end things before they'd really started. They didn't solve it that night, but they talked, really talked, for the first time about what they actually wanted, about whether 2 careers could survive in the same city, about what it would mean to build a life around someone, instead of just enjoying their company until it became inconvenient. 2 days later, Nathan turned the offer down, not out of pressure, but because he realized he didn't want a version of his future that didn't include the woman across the table, and when he told her, Claire didn't say thank you. She just asked him to help her pick a paint color for the apartment they hadn't technically discussed sharing yet, which both of them understood was its own kind of answer. A year and a half after that first night at Calabria, Nathan brought Claire back to the same restaurant, the same corner booth if the hostess could manage it, and when she sat down across from him, confused about why they were back at the scene of her worst date ever, he slid a small box across the table instead of the breadbasket. She didn't say yes right away. She laughed first, the same surprised laugh from that first night. Then she cried a little. Then she said yes, so quietly he almost asked her to repeat it. They married the following spring in her parents' backyard, under string lights her mother had insisted on for weeks. On the gift table, tucked between the cards, sat a framed vintage map of Portland that Nathan had found in a dusty bookshop downtown, the same kind Claire used to collect but had stopped buying once life got busier. And when she unwrapped it that morning, her hands went still for a moment before she pulled him into a hug that lasted longer than either of them planned. During his toast, Nathan told the room the only part of the story most of them already knew but never tired of hearing, that the best thing that ever happened to him started with a man who didn't know how lucky he was, walking out on a woman who deserved better and a stranger who almost didn't ask if he could sit down. Claire, holding his hand under the table, leaned over during dessert and whispered the same line she still says every October when they pass that restaurant on their old street, that getting stood up that night turned out to be the luckiest disaster of her entire life, and that some nights the worst thing that happens to you is only the universe clearing a seat for something better to sit down.